Thank you. Thank you, and thanks for coming out and joining me. And it is a pleasure to be here at Porter Square Books. I used to live up the street, and so this was my bookstore for a while. Um, uh, so I've spent a lot of money here, so I'm getting a little back. Um, and I also just I like to give a sort of plugs for independent bookstores. I'm sort of coming to the end of this book tour for this new books we have and When I Die, and I decided when I did this book, which is published by Norton, one of the sort of the last big independent publishers, that I didn't want to go to any chains. And conveniently, Borders went out of business just in time. They were so crushed by my refusal. I hadn't thought of that. And I only wanted to go to independents, and which can be sort of wonderful, and it's great to be in a sort of a thriving independent bookstore like this. But there's also sort of a feeling going around the country to some of the great independents. You sometimes feel like you're taking a tour of a hospice. I mean, independent bookstores are in terrible, terrible trouble. So buy lots of books from them, not just my books, but all sorts of books. Keep your independence alive. Don't do that thing that, as I learned on this trip, some people do in independent bookstores. They go and they browse the books, and then they look up on their phone the Amazon price, and then they order it for a few dollars cheaper. You're paying for a wonderful, wonderful service in these stores, which is the curatorial function of the independent bookstore. And that comes to mind, especially tonight, because I'm borrowing a copy of this book from Porter Square, because I was just down. I've been reporting on Occupy Wall Street, and I was down in Zuccotti Park. And as you probably know, Mayor Bloomberg decided to sort of, in the dead of night at 1 a.m., to send in 1,000 police officers in riot gear to clear it out. And one of the things that they did, which was especially sort of important to me as a writer, was that they trashed the library. Occupy Wall Street is this fascinating thing. One of the first things they did was build a library, a free library in Lower Manhattan, where there aren't very many libraries anymore. And in fact, the only bookstore was a Borders, and that's gone now. So you would see, families who had nothing to do with the politics showing up to this library to get children's books for their kids. It was a beautiful, wonderful library, professional librarians, and it got trashed. And I'll come back to this at the end. Right now, I mean, we're literally today trying to figure out. We know many books, hundreds or thousands, were actually destroyed. But I think about that in terms of the sort of the function of bookstores like this and libraries like this, and also sort of the stories that I end up telling in this book, Sweet Heaven When I Die, that grew out of my last two books, a book called The Family and a book called C Street, were the result of a long immersion, submersion, and the sort of authoritarian subcultures of American fundamentalism. And and it was a fascinating world, but it's not a world that gives one a lot of hope or even a lot of laughs, or it can be kind of crushing at times. And I remember the motto of this one of the fundamentalist organizations I was writing about, an old motto they had, was that they helped bring together political leaders to make decisions. And there's this pretentious little bit of Latin, beyond the din of the vox populi, beyond the voice of the people. That was their idea. I ended the last book, and this is sort of what launched me into this book, with this other line that I like. And it comes from America's worst president in history. You're all sitting here thinking James Buchanan, 1857, 1861. So he did a terrible job. But he had this one great line at a time when Southern politicians, some politicians were saying, oh, let's not argue. Let's agree to disagree. We'll have our slaves, you have your factories, and we'll just all be peaceful. And he responded, he said, I like the noise of democracy. The noise of democracy, to me, is really key. The noise of democracy, that's what you saw down in that Occupy Wall Street library. And it's not always pretty. The noise of democracy is raucous. It's not always reasonable, well-informed debate. It's filled with eccentricity and downright kookiness and argument and disagreement and sharp tongues, sharp elbows. That's the noise of democracy. And out of that comes not, I think, well, I should say, when you write about religion for a long time, as I have, you often get, you're doing media type things, and you get asked this sort of question. Everyone wants to know, what is the great common denominator of American belief? They want to sort of even it all out. And, the real answer is that there isn't one. That should be obvious in a democracy. We don't have a common denominator of belief. We have a common denominator of form, of agreement to be in this space together, in this public space, and to argue or to coexist. The sound of all these sort of religious beliefs, political beliefs together, coming together all at once, that sounds not harmony. That's not harmony. It's cacophony. Cacophony is the sound that I'm most interested in as a writer. Cacophony is a sound, if you've ever been in a choir, or you've been in some kind of religious house of worship, and you're sitting there and you're singing, and the person next to you doesn't sing quite as wonderfully as you do, that's cacophony. And you keep singing with them. You say, okay, I'm committed to this. I'm committed to sharing this space and singing this song. So this book was me setting out to hear some cacophony after a long immersion in the sort of enforced, coerced, numbing harmony of American fundamentalism. There's a little fundamentalism within this book, but it's so eccentric that I decided to include it. And I'm going to start off, I'm going to read a few short passages from different stories. It's 13 stories of people who are all have this, they're all sort of caught on this tightrope between despair on one end and desire on the other, this kind of fatalism, and over here, imagination. And they're people who, they walk that tightrope. They're not people who are going to sort of settle for the middle. That takes them to some strange places, like this first person I want to introduce you to in an essay called The Rapture. Her name is Sandra Shea, and she's sort of a real estate faith healer. She faith heals apartments. That's her business. Let me give you her full title. I encountered her when I decided I wanted to write about the economy, the material. I want to follow the money of New Age belief. And I found Sandra, and I said, can I spend some time with you? And she gave me her business card. Bhakti Sandra Shea, B.A., M.A., J.D., guide, teacher, an adept member of the Great White Universal Brotherhood and Sisterhood of Light, ritual master in the High Council of Gore, universal Kabbalist, Reiki master, metaphysician. That's her business card. Okay, so that is our first guide here, and you have to excuse me. I have a case of what's now called Zuccotti lung. Anyone read about this in the paper? It's the cough you get when you spend a lot of time sleeping on the ground in the park, which I've been doing, reporting about this. So I got to go with Sandra to faith heal an apartment. And one of the things I discovered is that every big real estate broker in New York has in their Rolodex somewhere someone like Sandra, someone whom they can call when a high-end property isn't moving. And they can bring her in, and as we'll see, she can perform some sort of magical rituals, which you can decide for yourself may or may not help in the sale. Jim Farah, a Corcoran real estate agent, sat with perfect calm as Sandra squirted holy water, tap, blessed by her, dispense from a pink plastic spritzer, on the carpet, ceiling, and walls of a Kips Bay apartment he had been trying to sell. It was a one-bedroom in a doorman building with an open terrace overlooking that's what I'm talking about, and overlooking St. Martin's dazzling gold-domed Armenian Cathedral and the East River. And it was priced very reasonably at $680,000. I just realized, when you're doing a book tour and like you're in Iowa and you say $680,000, there's gasps and laughs. And in Boston, you're like, "Ooh, that's a steal." Can I get in on that? It wasn't moving. So Farah, a sober, dignified man with neat gray hair, a black jacket, and a gray sweater, an Episcopalian, a former retail executive with no supernatural experience, called Sandra on the recommendation of a colleague. Now she was standing in the living room, her eyes fluttering and her shoulders twitching as she called in a full congregation of minor and major gods. "Jim," I whispered, is any of this kind of, I don't know, hard to swallow?" Farah shook his head and offer the best defense of New Ageism I've encountered. Absolutely.